Rabbi.
Yeah, how are you?
I'm doing good. Mazel tov.
Thank you very much.
I'm sure you're very happy, huh?
I'm very happy.
And we're happy for Hadassah.
We're thrilled.
That's that. And to be honest, that was a surprise.
Yeah,
but
it always is.
Those are the kind of surprises you like.
That's right. That's exactly right. Okay, we're going to start in 2 minutes. We're ready?
We're ready.
Okay.
Small class.
Okay, everyone, good evening. So, okay, so we're going to start now. The Parsha today that we're going to learn, of course, is the weekly portion, which is the portion of Chukas. It's in the book of Numbers, the 6th portion. And I'll give you, before I start talking about the more detailed, I'll give you a brief synopsis. There are two major themes in this week's portion, and I want to talk about both of them tonight. The first theme is the opening. What I will ask everyone is to please mute yourself. And when you want to ask something, you can unmute yourself. That'll be very helpful. The first theme is the mitzvah of the red heifer. Do you know how to mute yourself? Yeah, mute, please. There's a mute button. Press it, because otherwise we'll hear the background noise all the time.
Is it mine?
It probably is.
Well, why is it probably mine?
Because everyone else is muted.
Is that?
Okay. The mitzvah of the red cow. The red cow. The mitzvah of the red cow is. It's basically a super rational mitzvah, which we'll talk about soon, what those mitzvahs are. It's a mitzvah that tells us as follows: that if someone became defiled means ritually unclean, by either contact with the corpse itself or being in the vicinity of a corpse, under the same roof with the corpse, and that sheds ritual impurity. When a person comes in contact with a corpse, he becomes defiled, and he has to undergo a process of purification that takes a week. What's done is, and the mitzvah is, that it was supposed to take a red cow, completely red, means it doesn't even have 2 black hairs on it. And you're supposed to slaughter the cow outside the camp, burn it, and with the ashes of this cow, and with some other items, create a solution with living water, with water from a spring, and that water with the ashes should then be sprinkled on this person who became defiled, and they do the sprinkling on the 3rd and 7th day, and at the end of the 7th day, this person is ritually clean. Okay, he's may once again enter into the holy temple. Why is this doing this? He may once again enter the holy temple, the precinct of the temple, and live life as he was accustomed to, of course. Now, there are many details in this law, but the main overarching theme of this law is that it is one of those mitzvahs that we have absolutely no idea why we have this mitzvah. It is one of those mitzvahs that are completely super rational, which, as I said, I will discuss that in more detail as we progress tonight. The other thing that's in this week's portion, which is right after that, is it skips 38 years. You see, the Jewish people leave Egypt, and a year later, they're given this, about a year later, or a little more than a year, they're given all these mitzvahs, beginning from Mount Sinai, of course. They're given the mitzvah of the red cow in the 2nd year of their desert journey, and then the Torah skips the whole 38 years. And in this very portion, it tells us of the events that happened at the end of in the 39th year of the Jewish people's journey in the desert. So the 38 years in between, we don't really have any record or what really transpired. The Torah doesn't share with us anything of note that it feels necessary to share with us. The next very important event is what is shared with us in this portion, and that is that Moses' sister Miriam dies. She dies on the 10th day of Nisan, 5 days before Pesach. And we all know that in the desert, the Jewish people were provided with all their needs. Manna fell for them from heaven every morning, and they had food. This manna was miraculous. It tasted like anything you wished, and it was just a very interesting type of substance. It also, one did not have to go there was no waste from that food, and the Jewish people ate that throughout the entire journey through the desert. That was the food. Where did they get drink in the desert? Where did they get water from? So that was also a miracle. We're told that when the Jewish people left Egypt, God told Moses to strike the stone, to hit the stone, and that the stone would suddenly, miraculously provide water. And in this, right after they left Egypt, this happened. Within a couple of weeks, the water started coming to them every day for fresh water out of a stone. Again, a miracle. And that lasted for 38 years, the 39 years. And we're told that this miracle happened in honor of Moses' sister Miriam. Because of her merit, the Jewish people got water in such a miraculous way. Now, what happened was when she died, at the end of the 40 years, or in the 39th year, on the 10th day of Nisan, so now they suddenly, no more water. Her merit, expired because she was no longer here. So the water ceased to go. They wake up in the morning, the water, the rock dried up. There's no more water. So the Jewish people, as they know how, they're complainers. So they complained to Moses, we don't have water. So Moses went to God, and he asked, and they complained very harshly against Moses. They said, why did you take us out of Egypt? You promised us to bring us to this promised land. That never happened. And we're not there yet. It's 39 years later. We'd rather die in Egypt than die from thirst in the desert. They were very, very rough, very tough on him. And God, of course, answers their cry and tells Moses to go over to a certain rock and speak to the rock and ask this rock to give water. The same thing he did 39 years ago, almost the same thing. And Moses goes over to the rock, and instead of talking to the rock, he strikes it with his staff. He hits the rock with his staff twice. And once that happened, the rock started giving water, gushed forth with water, and the Jewish people had water once again to drink. But the story doesn't end there. God got upset with Moshe. Why? Because God said, why didn't you listen to what I told you? I told you to speak to the rock. Why did you hit it? There was no need to hit the rock. Yet Moses did hit the rock. And because of that, God told him, you have lost you forfeited your right to go into the land of Israel. You will not go into the land of Israel because of that. You and Aaron who did this, and you will both die in the desert, and you will not merit to lead the Jewish people into the land. It will have to be done through your student Joshua. That's the story. There are a number of other incidents that happened in this week's portion, but this is what I want to focus on right now. These two topics. One is the mitzvah of the Red Heifer, and the other is the story with Moshe. Okay, so let's begin with the Red Heifer. Or before I do that, let me ask a few questions on the story of Moshe and the stone. Let's even say that Moshe made a mistake. Let's even say he made the mistake by hitting the rock instead of talking to the stone. Is that so severe a sin that would cause him to lose the most important thing he ever dreamt of, which is to go into the land of Israel and bring the people into the land? Is hitting instead of speaking that severe a sin to lose this most important thing? Isn't God being a little harsh on Moses in this incident? Does it make sense to, we know that in Torah everything is midah keneged midah, which means it's measure for measure. Every punishment is measured according to the sin. You do a very bad sin, you get a bigger punishment. You do a milder sin, you get a smaller punishment. That's justice, that's fair. So this sin seems to be, this punishment seems to be a little more harsh, or a lot more harsh than what the sin would demand. So why is it? And then the other question is, Moshe is speaking to God now for 39 years. He probably learned a thing or two about God. God tells you to speak to the stone. What prompted him to hit the stone? What was this decision all about? Why did he go ahead and violate, so to say, God's commandment to him to speak instead of hit? Now, you can answer, well, he was basically doing what he did the first time. In the first instance, when God told him to extract water from a rock, he was told to do that via striking the rock. As I mentioned to you, in the beginning of their journey in the desert, right after they leave Egypt, within a couple of weeks, the same incident happened. The Jews don't have water, and God tells them to hit the rock. So he thought, hit the rock, okay, so God said to speak, but maybe he means hit. But that's, that would be good for a 5-year-old, a 6-year-old, a simpleton, make such a mistake. God doesn't, if God says speak, you don't hit. Why did he hit the stone? Okay, so let's now go back to the mitzvah of the red cow. Okay. It's interesting to note, and I'm going to quote it to you. It's in the beginning of this parsha, portion. It's in Numbers chapter 19, verse 1 and 2. Listen to the words. God spoke to Moses, instructing him to convey to Aaron, saying, because this is a mitzvah that Aaron and his sons will have to do. So God tells Moshe to give over this mitzvah to Aaron, and this is the mitzvah. And this is the way that Torah introduces this mitzvah. I'll say it in the Hebrew first. Zos Chukat HaTorah. This is the quintessential rule of the Torah that God has commanded. And what is this quintessential rule of the Torah? He goes on to tell him the mitzvah of the red cow. Now we all know there are 613 commandments in the Torah, right? If I were to ask anyone over here listening now, what in your opinion would be considered the most important mitzvah, the quintessential mitzvah in the Torah? Would you tell me that even in your wildest guess that it would be the mitzvah of the red cow? I don't think so. I think you would maybe choose belief in God, or monotheism, let's say, don't worship idols, love your fellow as yourself. Mitzvahs of that encompass greater, a greater idea, something that, first of all, is eternal. After all, the mitzvah of the red cow, when was the last time we even observed this ritual? It was in the time of the temple. So for the last 2,000 years, we don't even have the opportunity to do this mitzvah. Where there's no temple, you can't do it. And we don't have a red cow. Always every few years, you have a lead story in the New York Times or somewhere else that they found a red cow somewhere in someone's farm, and they're protecting it, and they're going to fly it to Israel. Because people seeing that like, wow, it's a great sign that the Mashiach is coming, which only tells you that it's so rare and that it's so doesn't happen often. In fact, the last time this ritual was done was thousands of years ago. So how could it be that this ritual that is done so seldom, almost never, should be the one that the Torah considers the quintessential mitzvah of the Torah? And when you look at the details of the mitzvah, none of it makes sense. There's not one part of this mitzvah that makes any sense to us. There's so many it's so paradoxical, the mitzvah. I'll just point out one of them. The one that administers, so I said to you that the way it's done is you slaughter the cow, you burn its ashes, and you burn it, and you take the ashes, mix it with water, and with that solution, the Kohen sprinkles it on the priest sprinkles it on the person who became defiled. And with this sprinkling, the person becomes pure. That's very nice. That's a wonderful thing. We need to make people pure. But the irony of the whole thing is that the person doing the sprinkling himself becomes defiled. So here he is sprinkling on the person who's going to become pure, and the person doing the sprinkling now becomes defiled. And what does he have to do to become pure again? He himself does not have to be sprinkled with the ashes, because his level of impurity is not as severe as a person who came in contact with a corpse. So he just has to immerse in a mikveh, in a body of water, and he becomes pure. But think about it. The guy, all he's doing is making someone pure. How does he become defiled? But that's how it is. That's how the mitzvah works. So there are a lot of paradoxes in this mitzvah, and it's one of those mitzvahs that even King Solomon, who was the wisest of all men, who said that I have figured out every mitzvah, but this one remains. This one I cannot grasp. It's beyond me. I have no clue what it's about. So let me explain for a few minutes something about mitzvahs and the relationship to God through mitzvahs. We know that in the Torah there are 613 mitzvahs, commandments. But these 613 commandments are divided into 2 or 3 categories. What are the 3 categories of commandments? Well, we know that there are the rational mitzvahs, those mitzvahs that the Talmud tells us that had God not given us the commandments, we would have done them, figured them out on our own. For example, if you go over to any non-religious person, or even atheist, let's say, and you tell him, what's your opinion about murder? He's going to say it's terrible. It's an abhorrent thing. The person should be put in jail the rest of his life. Some will even say he deserves the death penalty. It is abhorrent. It is the most horrible act. Everyone agrees, most people agree that is something that is unacceptable. And the same with many others, theft, adultery, and things of that nature. That means those are the category. There are certain mitzvahs in the Torah, and not to murder is a mitzvah, and not to steal is a mitzvah. It's a commandment not to steal. So it's those mitzvahs that we are told that even if the Torah would not have been given, somehow mankind would have figured out a way to have a consensus that those things are unacceptable. Those are known as the rational mitzvahs, in Hebrew mishpatim. But then there's a category of mitzvahs that are not that simple. That the Torah tells us that we would not, it's a category of mitzvahs that on our own we would not figure them out. We would not reach that conclusion. Yet, once God gave it to us, and He tells us to do it, He explains us why, our minds can grasp it. We understand it. For example, the mitzvah of Shabbos. To observe the Shabbos every 7 days. I don't think that mankind would come up with such a mitzvah had God not given it. I don't know if we would do it. The proof is that mankind did not, that any other people besides the Jewish people do not do this. They don't have a Shabbos. That means that the mind doesn't compel you to do it. Murder, your mind compels you to outlaw murder. But Shabbos, your mind, your rational mind, does not compel you to institute a day where you rest and you do what we do on Shabbos. Right? But when you talk to an average Jew who is observing Shabbos, and you ask him, "Nu, what do you think about Shabbos?" He or she will tell you it's the biggest blessing in the world. It's the most beautiful thing ever. I don't know what I would do without Shabbos. It makes so much sense. It's such a beautiful thing. We relate to it. We love it. It's a blessing from on high. That means our minds do greatly appreciate the mitzvah of Shabbos. And the same thing with the mitzvah, let's say, to eat matzah on Pesach. Eating matzah on Pesach, I'm not sure that we on our own would have come to that conclusion that we have to eat matzah on Pesach and not eat chametz, the leavened bread, and to make a seder on Passover. I don't know if our minds, our rationale would compel us to do such a thing. But ask any Jew who observes Pesach, a seder on Passover night, the matzah. There's so much meaning behind it. Everyone loves it. It's just a beautiful thing, right? That means, again, those are the mitzvahs that maybe we would not have done it and reached the we would not have decided to do it on our own. But once it's there, we have a great appreciation for it. That's the second category of mitzvahs known as Eidot. Eidot. And then there's, which means testimonials. They're there to remind us of a past event. Shabbos reminds us of God created the world in 6 days, and He rested on the Shabbos. Pesach reminds us that we went out of Egypt. And all these testimonial mitzvahs that are there to remind us of past events or something, a special ideal or whatever it may be. The common denominator between these two first categories that I just described are that the mind understands them. One, the mind compels you to come to it, and the other one, once it's there, you can appreciate it. The third category is, of course, the category of the super-rational mitzvahs, those mitzvahs that even after we're given them, and we're given all the details, they still defy human logic. We don't know why we do them. And to cite a number of examples, the mitzvah of the most famous, the mitzvah of keeping kosher. You ask a person that keeps kosher, or anyone for that matter, why do you keep kosher? He doesn't know. He says, God wants me to keep kosher. It's in the Torah. Of course, it's a mitzvah. That's why I do it. But I don't really, why? Why did God tell us to do this? What does He have against eating pork? What does He have against eating milk with meat together? No one knows. The Torah doesn't share with us the reason for it, and nor does it the Talmud or any other commentary tell us why. So we're left wondering why we have this mitzvah, but we do it anyway because it's the will of God. So that's the third category, which is the super rational mitzvah. That's quite famous. And there are many mitzvahs in each category. There are many mitzvahs in each category. Now, the Torah tells us in this particular portion that between all the mitzvahs of the Torah, and even between the ones that are super rational, there's one mitzvah that is the quintessential mitzvah of the Torah, which is the mitzvah of the red cow. That is the quintessential mitzvah of the entire Torah. So the question is, out of the 613, why this one? So let me begin explaining this as follows. There's an old Hasidic saying that goes like this. And I want you to appreciate this. Before I tell you the Hasidic saying, let me ask you a question. Which mitzvah do you appreciate more? The mitzvah of keeping Shabbos and giving charity, or the mitzvah of not eating milk together with meat? Which one do you have more of an appreciation for? And tell me why. You can answer. Unmute yourself and give me an answer if you have one. Anybody? Okay, I guess not. Okay. Most people, I think, would tell you. Yeah, go ahead.
Or appreciate.
What?
Enjoy or appreciate?
Appreciate. I don't know, what's the difference? What do you mean by joy and appreciate? What's the difference in your mind between joy and appreciate?
For me, it's as simple as putting on the tefillin. That's where I make my connection. It makes me feel very connected.
I didn't ask about the tefillin. I asked you about kosher or Shabbos and charity. Which one do you appreciate more?
I would say charity.
Charity the most. Why?
Feels good.
It feels good. Why does it feel good?
It makes you connected with other human beings and yourself. They're all good. You can't say which one is better.
I didn't ask you which is better. I asked you which one do you appreciate more?
I appreciate all of them.
At the same level?
They all should be done at the same level.
I didn't ask what they should be done. I'm asking which one do you appreciate. It's not a trick question. It's a simple question. The meaning of my question is as follows. When I ask what do you appreciate more, what I mean is appreciate it more. You're excited about it more. Something you understand why you're doing, you are most naturally going to appreciate and enjoy more. That's just simple logic. But here goes the Hasidic saying. And I quoted this many times before in my classes, and I'll explain it. The Hasidic saying goes like this. The world says that I wish I would be able to do the mitzvahs that I don't understand with the same enthusiasm I do the mitzvahs that I do understand. And that makes sense, right? Because the mitzvahs that I do understand, I have enthusiasm. It just comes with a certain amount of enthusiasm. The mitzvahs I don't understand, I have to do it only because God wants me to do it, but I don't really have an appreciation beyond that. Me, myself, is not really excited about it because I don't even know why I'm doing it. The Hasidic, say the Hasidim, just the opposite. The Hasidic saying goes that I wish I would do the mitzvahs that I do understand with the same enthusiasm that I do the mitzvahs that I don't understand. Now I want to elaborate on that for a minute. What does that mean? Why would you say that I wish I did the mitzvahs that I do understand with the same enthusiasm I do the mitzvahs that I don't understand? That's counterintuitive. Don't you do the mitzvahs that you appreciate and understand with more enthusiasm? So what does this Hasidic saying mean?
Rabbi,
yeah.
Isn't that the reason why we study Torah to begin with, so that we should understand?
It's a good question. That's exactly right. Don't we study the Torah so that we should understand? So here we're saying that the Hasidic saying says just the opposite. That I wish I did the mitzvahs I understand with the same enthusiasm I do mitzvahs that I don't understand. It sounds counterintuitive. But let me share with you why it's not, and why it's significant. And here comes the big question. What's our relationship with God based on? What is our relationship with God? What happens when you do a mitzvah that you don't understand? Why are you doing it? Anyone? We're doing it because we submit our will to God's will. God wants this. I'm Jewish. My soul is connected to God, and my soul wants to do what God wants. So if I do understand or I don't understand, makes very little difference whether I'm going to do it or not. I'm going to do it. If God wants this, I'm going to do it. Now, if I'm lucky enough and God shared with me the reason why He wants me to do this, great, that's a bonus. But if He doesn't share with me the reason, so He doesn't share with me the reason. That's not why I do mitzvahs. You see, it depends where you're coming from. What is the foundation of our mitzvah observance? Is it because my mind compels me, my rationale compels me to do it? If that's what mitzvahs are, here's where there's a deficiency in that attitude. If the attitude is that I do mitzvahs because it's a wonderful thing to do, because it makes so much sense and it's a rational thing and it's I can wrap my mind around it and so on. The deficiency, the problem with that attitude is we all know how limited in scope our own rationale is. Our intellect is very limited in scope. So imagine you relied on your intellect. What my mind tells me is right, I'm going to do. And if my mind doesn't tell me it's right, I'm not going to do it. So first of all, that to begin with is a flawed understanding of our commitment to God. Our commitment to God is not one that comes from your rationale. It comes from our soul, our devotion to God, our commitment, and if God has to make sense to us, then He's not God. One of the great Kabbalists once said, Ilu yadativ hayitiv. If I would know Him, I would be Him. Which means that God is beyond knowledge. He's beyond our comprehension. Think about it. God created the whole world, right? Which includes rationale. God created intellect. Without God, there is no intellect. That means He created intellect, which means He's beyond our intellect. So if God says, I want something, it has to make sense to human intellect. You're limiting God to your level of intellect, which is, to begin with, limited in scope. God is obviously way beyond it. He's not bound by human intellect. You and me are bound by human intellect. But God, of course, is not. So when God says, I want this and this particular mitzvah for you to do, you're going to say, well, if you can fit it into my little scope, my little intellect, then I'll be willing to do it. And if not, not. You're failing to understand where this mitzvah comes from. If it comes from God, it's going to be something that's by definition beyond your rationale. The mitzvahs that we do know the reason for it, you think you really know the reason for it? What are the mitzvahs that we do appreciate from our rational standpoint? Let's say the mitzvah I said before, for you examples. Don't murder. Let's even take that mitzvah, don't murder. Is that a rational mitzvah? Shake your head, yes or no?
Of course.
A rational mitzvah, of course. I got news for you. It's not a rational mitzvah at all. How do I know? Because it comes from God. God is beyond rationale. It's beyond human intellect. So if it's coming from God, it's by definition beyond human intellect. The God did us a great favor. You know what the favor He did was? That He allowed for His mind, for His will, to be able to be absorbed in some level by our intellect. So it even makes sense to our human mind. That's a great kindness from God, but it doesn't have to be that way. When He doesn't fit His will into our intellect, like those mitzvahs that are super rational, we shouldn't say, that's not fair, and I'm not going to do it because I don't understand it. You should be thankful that there are a number of mitzvahs that He even pressed and squeezed into our human intellect that will make sense over there. Because by definition, none of it should make sense. He's beyond intellect. He's beyond human intellect. So how could any of it make sense on human terms? But He's so kind to us that He wants us to appreciate His mitzvahs at every level. So He makes the mitzvahs, most of them at least, rationally explained. That's a kindness from God. That's not something we expect. That's not something we should take for granted. And therefore, when it doesn't happen, we shouldn't kick. We shouldn't, we shouldn't rebel. We shouldn't say, well, if it doesn't make sense in my mind, I'm not going to do it. If that's the attitude, then you're failing to appreciate what a mitzvah is to begin with. So let me explain a few things about the mitzvahs that we think we do understand. Let's take even something so basic as murder. Why is murder wrong? Anyone want to share with me why murder is wrong? It's so obvious, right? Why is murder wrong? You have no right to take another human's life. It's not yours to take, and he wants to live his life. Let him live, right? Who gives you the right to take another human life? So that makes sense, right? But let me ask you something. What about if that person who is alive asks you, please take my life? He begs you to end his life. Pull the plug on me. I don't want to live anymore. I'm 99 years old or 104 with terminal cancer. I can't go on like this. I'm not going to, I'm bedridden. I'm in a coma. I can't live like this anymore. And he begs you, please administer something that will end my life peacefully and quickly, and that's it. If murder is wrong because it's rational, because our human intellect dictates so, what do you do when your human intellect dictates that murder is right?
Well, you'll be willing to pay the price if you do it.
Are you allowed to do it when it makes sense? Are you allowed to take a life even if it does make sense to you? Obviously not. So the point is that we think that murder, but you ask, why not? The person is suffering. He's begging for you to end his suffering. He wants to end his life. There's no purpose for him to live any further. Every doctor who's examined him says he'll never live a life of whatever you want to call it, of a productive life or whatever it is. He's terminally ill. He's never going to recover from this. You're just prolonging his suffering. End it, and that's it. But we know that the Torah doesn't allow us to do that. Now, you say, that doesn't make sense. You're right, it doesn't. Mitzvahs never made sense. Mitzvahs are godly. They're super rational by definition. Once in a while, God pushes some of His intellect, His super rational mitzvahs, into our rational mind. So our rational mind can understand it also. You think it all makes sense? Even those mitzvahs that He made it so that we appreciate it on our level of intellect. Not every detail are we going to appreciate on our level of intellect. So we should never make the mistake thinking that mitzvahs begin and end with our rationale. They don't. They begin on God's level. They come from God. They're God's will. They're God's wisdom. God's wisdom is by definition beyond human wisdom. And therefore, as much as we try to wrap our mind around it, and God was kind, He gave us a lot to wrap our mind around, but you can't expect that every detail and aspect of it is going to be humanly graspable. But there's one mitzvah, and that goes. So I gave you. So what I just said to you was that all 613 mitzvahs at some level don't make sense. At the same time that that's true, it's also true that there are certain aspects of all of the mitzvahs, even the super rational ones, that make sense a little bit. Even the super rational mitzvahs, like not mixing milk and meat, there are some details of it that make sense to us. Although the more dominant, the mitzvah itself, most of it is beyond our rationale, but certain aspects of it we still can appreciate on the human level. So it goes both ways. Even the super rational mitzvahs, some of them some details of it are still rational, and even this rational mitzvahs, some details of it are super rational. Right? There's one mitzvah that defies all logic. There's not one detail of it that makes sense, and that is the red cow. From beginning to end, it is super rational. There's not one part of that mitzvah that we can understand. And that's why the Torah calls it's the quintessential mitzvah of the Torah. Why is it the quintessential mitzvah of the Torah? Because that really represents what mitzvahs are. It's God's will and wisdom, not ours. It's in the mitzvah of the red heifer, the red cow, where the quintessence of what a mitzvah is mostly observed. In other words, when you look at it from beginning to end, you realize this is God's wisdom, not ours. This is God's will. It defies human logic at every level. Not one detail of it makes sense to us. And that's why it's called the quintessential mitzvah of the Torah, because at the end of the day, that's what mitzvahs are. So how does a Jew relate to God? What lies at the foundation of our connection to God? Human logic. My relationship with God is at the level where God fit Himself into my mind. That is such a limited form of godliness. An aspect of God that is so limited that it can even fit into my small, tiny, infinitesimal little mind is a very limited form of godliness. That's the basis of our relationship with God. Our relationship is a soulful one. It comes from the neshama. And the neshama is way beyond our own limitations. God, the neshama of every person, in neshama meaning the soul, is a part of God above. It's a piece of Hashem that's put into every one of us. And it's from that perspective that we relate to God. When you do a mitzvah, your neshama and your body comes along the ride. Your neshama connects to God on a more, on a super rational way, on a more transcendent level. We don't limit it to the human intellect. Why does God fit Himself in some cases into human intellect? Because God also wants that our minds should be partners in this whole endeavor. But at the foundation of it is beyond that. What's the quintessential aspect of our relationship with God is a super rational mitzvah. It's not because it's my mind that compels me to do this or even appreciates it. I put away my mind. I submit myself to God. That is the foundation of our relationship with God. Submission to God. Not where I can, where God has to submit to me, where He has to make sense to my mind. Think about that for a moment. When people say, if I don't understand it, I'm not doing it. What they're looking is for God to submit to them, instead of them submitting to God. If God always has to fit Himself into your little tiny mind, you're asking for His submission to you, not you to Him. And that's not a relationship. Certainly not with God. And that's how we have to understand mitzvahs. You're right. The Torah, we learn Torah to appreciate and understand as much as we can. You said that, Morris. So you're right about that. But that comes with that's with a caveat. Don't lose focus of what it really is all about. It's about your neshama connecting to God at a transcendent, super-rational level, which is really, then the relationship is much more reliable. If it's only based on your human intellect, it is so unreliable. Human intellect fluctuates, it changes. Today I'm in the mood, tomorrow I'm not. Today it makes sense, tomorrow I think differently. I change my perspectives, I have a different way of looking at things. That is so unreliable, the human mind. Look what's going on in our world today. If I told you a month ago, let's not get into that. I don't want to bring politics into it. But the point is, there's certain things that in an instant changed. Society changes like this. The norms of today were not the norms of a month ago. And the norms of a month ago weren't the norms of 2 months ago. So the mind is a very unreliable thing to rely on. It's nice to employ it in the service of God, and that's why we learn a lot of Torah, to try to absorb as much as we can in our mind as well, and in our heart, and our feelings, and so on. The human aspect is a very important part of the relationship. But it's about going beyond your human limitations. It's becoming godly. Don't make God human. Make the human godly. And the way you make a human godly is by going out of your limitations. And the way you go out of your limitations is when you do the mitzvahs that are super rational. And that's why when the Torah opens up this portion and says, this is the quintessential mitzvah of the Torah. The Torah is precisely focused on this one mitzvah. Because in this mitzvah, the Jew submits entirely. And that's the Hasidic saying. I wish I did all those mitzvahs that I do understand with the same enthusiasm as I do the mitzvahs that I don't understand. Because the Hasidic understanding of mitzvahs is much deeper. That the mitzvah is about transcendence. It's about total submission to God. And where do you find the total submission? In the mitzvah that you don't understand. And a Jew is enthusiastic about becoming one with Hashem on God's terms, not on my terms. And in the mitzvah that don't make sense, that's where that's most manifest. That brings me to the conversation of Moshe and the stone. If this is true, then why did Moshe violate what God told him? Why didn't he submit? God told him to speak to the stone. Why did he hit the stone? It seemed when you read it so trivial, big deal. He hit it. He saw the stone understands. The stone doesn't. Like, who cares? What's the problem? Hitting, speaking. Here's a better question. Why does God if God wants to make a miracle and have water flow from a stone, does he need Moses to tell the stone to give water? If you're going to have water flow out of a stone, you don't need anyone to tell anything. It's coming from God. It's a miracle. It's a magnificent miracle. Let it just happen from God. What does Moshe have to walk over to the stone? Mr. Stone, please give water. What does it mean? What is that all about? Why are you bothering with that to make him even go through that exercise of speaking to the stone? And why didn't Moshe listen? Why did he hit the stone? So in this story lies a great, great, profound lesson in Jewish leadership. And let me share it with you. I'll answer the first question. Why did God tell Moshe to speak to the stone? If it's a miracle anyway, if I want my kid to do homework, I have to go tell him, do homework. Because he's a human being, he understands what I'm telling him, and you want to tell him to do his homework, you go over and tell him. A stone? A stone doesn't hear. A stone doesn't understand. What's going on here? So the answer is, and Rashi tells it to us, that what God wanted was, He wanted to teach the Jews a lesson. You know what the lesson was? You know, you're looking now at 39 years of the Jewish people in the desert. And that's a long time. They had a lot of ups and downs. The Jewish people complained a lot. They didn't listen. They worshipped the golden calf. They had the incident with the spies. They had the Korach rebellion. They had complaints. They didn't like this. They complained about that. It was a rocky relationship. Let's put it that way. Jews were not that obedient. Let's mildly speaking. They're not the most obedient people. Well, I shouldn't say that. We're pretty obedient. I mean, we stuck it out for 3,500 years. I don't think he has another nation that's been as obedient as us. But we know how to complain. We know how to rebel when we want to. I'll suffice that. So we'll leave it at that. God got tired of the Jewish people not listening to Him. So He tells Moshe, you know what, it's time to show the Jewish people what it means to listen to God. Stop being so stubborn. He says, so go over to that stone and tell it to give water. Let's see what happens. It's going to give water. What God was trying to do here was teach the Jewish people a lesson. Even a stone, when you speak to it, listens. How much more so the people who heard God speak at Sinai, I am God your Lord, I've taken you out of Egypt, and saw all the miracles and saw all the wonders. How much more so they should listen when God speaks to them. So with speaking to the stone, it's not because the stone has a will of its own and you have to convince it and you have to talk to it. It was for a reason that God told Moshe to speak to the stone, to teach the Jewish people a lesson, that even a stone, when it speaks, when it's spoken to, it listens. And you Jews are so stubborn. I keep telling you what to do, and you listen, and you complain, and you don't do, and you violate, and you rebel, and you make all kinds of problems. Now Moshe, the Jewish leader, is listening to this from God. He's saying, God wants me to speak to the stone. Listen what's going to happen. He makes the following calculation. He said, the Jewish people are the most important thing to God. He loves them without limit. Moshe, the faithful shepherd of the Jewish people, loves the Jewish people without limit. He says, what's going to happen if I speak to the stone and it gives forth water? You know what's going to happen? A day later, or a week later, or a month later, when the Jewish people are told to do something and they don't do it, God's always going to be able to tell them, you know, you're worse than a stone. You're worse than a rock. Even a rock listens when it's told to do something. Moshe said, no, that's not going to happen. I cannot do something now that will be a detriment to the Jewish people forever and ever. That whenever the Jewish people misbehave, they'll have this thing hanging over them and saying, even a stone is better than you. Moshe said, I cannot be used to become the agent which will bring only problems for the Jewish people in the future. That they'll be seen as less than a stone. So he goes over to the stone and hits it. So that God should never be able to say to the Jewish people, you're worse than a stone. Had he spoken to the stone and it would have given water, that would be a very, very big problem for the Jewish people. God would be able to punish them much easier by comparing them to a stone. They're even worse than a stone. A stone listens when it's told to do something. Moshe said, I'm not allowing that to happen. Think about this for a moment. He puts himself on the line to violate. He's violating God's will here. He's not doing what God told him to do. God told him to speak. And he's saying, I'm going to hit to protect the Jewish people. That's the hallmark. That is the self-sacrifice of a Jewish leader, of the Moses of the time. He puts himself on the line for the Jewish people. He's going to be punished for this. But he protected the Jewish people. It's a profound idea. What's the punishment? God tells him, you're not going into Israel. And I asked you before, That sounds harsh. The punishment has to fit the crime. In this case, it seems the punishment is much more severe than the crime. But when you think about it, it really isn't. Why isn't it? What did Moshe, imagine what happens, yeah? God sees that Moshe hit the stone. God turns to Moshe that night. He must have told him, Moshe, what did you do? I told you to speak to it. Why did you hit it? So Moshe must have told God what he was thinking, right? God, please don't use me to become an agent that's going to be a detriment to the Jewish people in the future. I can't be that person. I'm a leader. I'm supposed to protect them, not work against them. So God tells him, wow, you are indeed a very, very devoted leader. You're the one that led these people out of Egypt. And you're now bringing them, that are about to go into the land of Israel. You're so devoted to this people that you're even willing to overlook my commandment to you to protect them. God says to him, let's take a look at this for a moment. In the last 39 years, how many Jews died and were buried in the desert? Close to 600,000. They're not going into Israel, right? So God tells Moshe, you're the leader, you have just proven that you're the most devoted leader of this generation. I couldn't have chosen a better leader than you. It's unbecoming, therefore, of you as the leader to enter the land of Israel when your own flock, 600,000 of them, will not enter the land of Israel. You will remember why the people died in the desert, right? But that was as a result of the incident of the 12 spies that went to Israel 38 years earlier, and they came back with a bad report. They demoralized the Jewish people, and God punished them to stay in the desert for 40 years, until they all die. Only the next generation will go into Israel. God says to Moshe, you have proven to be such a loyal leader of this people. Does it make sense that you're going to go into Israel and leave your flock behind, buried in the desert? God said that's not right. If you've shown to be such a loyal leader of this people, then go till the end. It doesn't make sense that you should go in before they go in. You should bring them into Israel. So when they go in, you'll go in. So God says, you will be put to rest in the desert together with your sheep, with your flock, with your sheep, who you care so much for. And God loved what he did. Make no mistake about it. So it's not even so much as a punishment, as much as a natural reaction. It just became obvious how loyal Moshe was to the Jewish people, and that this was his generation. He cared for them more than anything else. He was even ready to violate and hit the stone rather than speak, which was God's will, to protect the Jewish people. It said, if that's your level of devotion, then it makes no sense that you shall leave your flock in the desert and you go into Israel. You should bring them into Israel. And therefore, until Mashiach comes, Moshe will be barred from going into Israel before his own flock, his generation of Jews, all go in with him. And that will happen when Mashiach comes. So God tells him, this is the result. So it's not even as if he's punishing him as much as he's telling him, this is the natural result. So did Moshe violate the God's command? What do we say? What is the essence of a commandment? To transcend yourself, right? And to submit to God. Right? It's self-transcendence. In this act of hitting the stone, Moshe transcended himself more than any other act ever. With this, he put himself on the line. He put the Jewish people before him. He put God before him. And Moshe knew that the Jewish people are the most precious thing to God. And to put them in danger of being compared even less than a stone would ultimately not be what God wants. No father wants that for their child, to be less than a stone. So Moshe puts himself out, and he becomes the quintessential leader of the Jewish people with this one act. And as a result, he's barred from going into Israel. This is the greatest self-transcendence that Moshe could ever experience. He put himself on the line, literally. That's true self-transcendence. to have transcendence of self, to go beyond yourself. And that's what a mitzvah is, to connect to God on God's terms, not on our own. And over here, Moshe went way beyond himself. And with that, he became the ultimate leader of the Jewish people. He starts off as a leader in Egypt, and of course with the incident of the golden calf, where he of course tells God, if you don't forgive the Jewish people, then erase me from the Torah, and I want nothing to do with this. He gives God an ultimatum more than once in his life. But with the story of the stone, he doesn't just give an ultimatum. He takes action, and he says, I'm going to protect the Jewish people. And he does. The result is, he stays in the desert. And later on in the Torah, when Moshe begs to go into Israel, it says that he begged God 515 times. It says he prayed 515 prayers that God should annul the decree and let him go into Israel. What do you think? He was thinking about himself, his own entry into the land of Israel. He was actually praying that he should bring all the people into Israel and the Mashiach should come right then and there. That was his prayer. It wasn't meant to be, obviously. It was still in exile. But that was what this is about. When you read the story, you just glance over it. Oh, it's a story, an interesting story. They didn't speak, which makes no sense. None of it makes sense when you learn it at face value. But when you understand what you're reading, and you go beyond below the surface to understand the depth, there's volumes and volumes of tremendous layers upon layers of wisdom here, of commitment. And we learn from this what it means to be ultimately devoted to a flock, to your people. It doesn't have to be where you are the Moses of the generation. You can be your own little Moses in your own home, or in your own little community, or wherever you are, you're a teacher in a classroom, you're the leader of that classroom. What is true leadership? True leadership is when you go beyond yourself on behalf of your flock, behalf of your students, behalf of your children, behalf of your community, behalf of your congregants, whoever it may be, to put yourself aside to the ultimate degree. Now think about that. Moshe, was there anything greater in his mind, in his life? Did he have a greater desire than to go to the Holy Land and build a holy temple and live that life? There was nothing greater to him than that. Put it all aside to protect Jewish people, that their name shouldn't be tarnished. They're less than a stone. Can you imagine? And that's the sign of a Jewish leader. A Jewish leader is not someone that knows how to give good advice and knows how to be a great organizer. That's wonderful traits, and it's important to have that. But Jewish leadership is about when you put to be the quality of putting yourself aside, not just aside, but completely giving yourself over, and at great personal cost, just like Moses. So we can do it in small ways. We don't have to rise to the level of Moses. No one expects that from us. But in a small measure, to be devoted to Moshe. To be devoted to the Jewish people. Any questions? Just 1 second. Jeremy, hi, come in. I just finished. Come. Sorry about that. So that's the point, and that's the lesson that we learn from this parsha. It's two wonderful details: the story of the red cow and that of Moshe hitting the stone, and how we connect the two. A relationship with God is about going beyond yourself. It's about putting yourself aside. We do that when we fulfill the mitzvahs that are super rational, and we do that when we lead the people and put ourselves aside for them. We submit to a higher calling. We submit to a higher to the truth, to the ultimate truth. And with that, I will open for questions. If anyone has, please feel free. And if not, we'll say goodnight till next week.
Remember, I have a question. It might be a silly question, but are we as Jews to look at mitzvahs as a gift?
Mitzvahs are the greatest gift ever.
And is is it okay? And it's okay for
What greater gift could you have than if you're given the opportunity to have a real relationship with God? Is there a greater gift than that? Is there a greater thing than that? It's the greatest opportunity. What other gift could you think of? So the mitzvahs are gifts, but they're much more than gifts. They make life meaningful. They make life worthy of living. They make life worthy of living. And that's why it's so important to actually do the mitzvahs, not just think about them or feel for them, to actually do them. Because where do you see real submittal? When you actually get up and do something for God. That's where you really connect with Him. If you think about it, you love it, you feel it, you're theorizing. That's all nice and it's important and good, but it doesn't take anything from you. Getting up and putting on tefillin, getting up and lighting Shabbos candles, getting up and keeping kosher, doing something for God, that's a relationship. It's like a spouse. It's like with you and your husband and your wife, right? Or your spouse, your husband. I love you, dear, right? But what are you ready to do for me? To do something, that's a relationship. A relationship is what you do, not what you feel or what you think. So thoughts and feelings are very important. Imagine someone just does, but he has no feeling for what he's doing. That's horrible. That's not either good. But the action is what counts most. Thank you so much, and have a wonderful evening, everyone. And we'll see you, God willing, in the next class, which will inform you.
Thank you, Rabbi. See you in the morning.
I'll see you in the morning. Thank you.
Thank you, Rabbi.
All the best. Okay. Thank you, everyone, for watching online and Facebook Live. We'll see you all next time. Bye-bye.